Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
It's a real pleasure and honor to be with you. And we've got two sessions scheduled. To the extent we don't cover anything in this session, we have like another session, right? So we may not get through all the slides depending on how the conversation goes. And I would encourage you to be interactive. I'll be talking about stuff. I'll be reading some very difficult language and passages that are written by very intelligent and theologically sophisticated people. But feel free to raise your hand if you have a question about something at some point. Feel free to answer and respond to my questions. The only thing I would say is, given our current global situation, given the deeply held beliefs, convictions that people have on this topic, I think it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. I just ask for humility, grace, and understanding for all of us here. People feel very strongly about this topic, and I think that's pretty evident if you pay attention to the news. And if you've ever had any sort of direct or indirect experience before. And I think Christians in good conscience can come to different conclusions about this topic with integrity. So as we have a discussion, just humility and grace is obviously crucial and important.
Jake, I ask you to talk as loudly as you can.
Okay, yeah.
We've got a HVAC noise in the back, so.
And if you can't hear me, if I'm too quiet, Jane, you can
I'll wait.
thank you. Okay, so the title of our class is The Paradox of a Just War. And we have two sessions planned. So what I'm going to do first is just kind of go through the outline of the two sessions, give you a sense of where we're going, and talk a little bit about what's planned and the aims of this course. These two sessions together. Yeah, so our first session today, I'm just going to first introduce us to the topic of war in Christian ethics and Christian theology, and ask the question, how should we as Christians think about war to begin with? Before we even start talking about a just war, before we even talk about the morality of war and the different moral considerations that are involved, as Christians, we have to answer the question first, does Christianity endorse war at all? Is it something that we as Christians can embrace? Or if not embrace, at least in some sort of extreme circumstances, qualified instances, endorse. And we'll first look at some ambiguous witnesses in the New Testament itself, talk a little bit about those, talk about the kind of deeply ambiguous voices on war in the Christian tradition a little bit. And then I'm going to introduce you to a pacifist voice, John Howard Yoder, the Mennonite theologian. Talk a little bit about him. Then we'll look at an alternative voice, Karl Barth, the Reformed theologian, if you're aware of Karl Barth. And then I'll have some concluding thoughts to sort of wrap it up and move us forward into our second session. And the second session, what we'll do then is we will focus a little more on actually kind of the ethics and morality of war and talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about the morality of going to war, what the moral considerations would be that have been identified over the course of human history, in part through the writings of Christian theologians, from the medieval times up into the present. How do you decide when to go to war if you do? And what are the moral considerations there? And then we'll talk a little bit about morality in war or during war. What are the moral considerations there? And then I'll talk, hopefully, if we have some time, the peculiar case of terrorism. Obviously, it's been relevant since September 11th in a very personal way for all of us as Americans, but more, recently with the events in Israel. And if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about that and terrorism and the peculiar questions and challenges that it poses to us as we think about this stuff. And the goal of these two sessions is not to give you a point of view which you should accept or embrace. I'm not here to tell you what to believe, but my goal here is to give you sort of a toolkit of ideas and thoughts and voices and considerations so that you can think with greater clarity, with greater sophistication, and with greater confidence about war, and come to some sort of hopefully better sense of where you stand as a Christian on war. And my goal, in all of my teaching, is to just give people tools to think a little more sophisticatedly, a little more confidently. And we have a lot of tools at our disposal as Christians and thinking about a lot of topics, so including this one as well. So first, I want to talk a little bit about just the ambiguous witnesses we have within the Christian tradition. And the first place to start would be the New Testament. And we'll go through a couple of passages, not in great detail. We're not going to do a very close reading, but we're just going to encounter a couple, talk a little bit about them, and that will set the stage for the discussion of our two theologians. So first we have a passage, very famous passage from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. And it starts with the Beatitudes. So I'll just read this out loud for those of you who are a little bit farther away and maybe joining remotely. Jesus says there, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account." And then later in the same sermon, "You have heard it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist an evildoer, but if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, give your coat as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the second mile." So thinking about our larger topic of war and how we as Christians could think about war, I just welcome feedback from y'all. What do you think this passage in Matthew is telling us? Why does it matter?
In the current context, I would say, with all contexts, I would say, particularly an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, it's a response that's appropriate in the event of a war or a circumstance that's causing war, instigating war, particularly. And I know enough about that scripture to say that that was a pretty extravagant response back in the day. Only take an eye if your eye's taken. Don't kill someone if your eye's taken. So it's a pushback saying be moderate with your response. Jesus's response is go further than that, which is sometimes difficult to understand.
Yeah. Thank you. Others?
Well, also maybe you have it later, but also by extension, love your neighbor and love your enemy.
Yeah,
Which to me is pretty clear, I think that we are meant not to go to war against our neighbor.
yeah. So this is like one of the passages in the New Testament when we're thinking about war, the justified use of violence. We as Christians would have to come to terms with a passage like this, right? And the teachings of Jesus. Because on the face of it, the people who are considered blessed are those who are suffering at the hands of violent offenders. And on top of that, there's this demand, right, that rather than taking an eye for an eye, you turn the other cheek. Which at the time, I mean, in its context, as you point out, is radical. And I've had a professor say, right, that one of the truly radical things about Jesus and his ministry is that if we look through history, there's the conception of sort of your tribe or your nation, and there's the other, an enemy. And that's a pretty prevalent conception when people across different cultures and times are thinking about their social circle, who they have moral obligations to, and who they don't. And what Jesus and his ministry does within the context of Judaism, the nation of Israel, is over time and through his actions sort of explodes the notion that there is anybody outside of your community, right? That everyone's your neighbor.
That's interesting from a personal standpoint. How do I respond to someone directly attacking me? But does that mean I stand by while the evildoer does evil to another person?
Exactly. Yeah, no, it's very good.
Now we're already.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one way to come to terms with this is to say, well, this is talking about when, someone strikes your cheek, right?
Yeah.
This is not talking about when, let's say, vandals or a crazy tribe from Germany, right, invade your city and starts ransacking and killing people, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's one way to deal with this passage, definitely. Another one, this is from John. This is on the night of Jesus' betrayal when he's in the Garden of Gethsemane. After Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley to a place where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas brought a detachment of soldiers together with police from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing that all that was to happen to him, came forward and asked them, "Whom are you looking for?" They answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus replied, "I am he." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's slave, and cut off his right ear. Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword back into its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?" So another really important passage in the Gospels. This is John's version of it. What I'll just note here is the symbolism of a detachment of soldiers coming with weapons, with police, and with the chief priests and the Pharisees. So in a sense, right, the powers of the state, those who are exercising violence in the interest of maintaining order, who have the authority to do that, together with those who have the religious and political authority to direct them and endorse them. All of these people come. Simon Peter, one of the disciples, right? The lovable, but sometimes like kind of goofy disciple that makes a fool of himself. In this context, Peter draws a sword, which apparently he had, and attacks one of the people in defense of Jesus. And Jesus tells him to put his sword back in its sheath, right? This kind of passage, we'll get to John Howard Yoder in a second. This is the kind of passage that John Howard Yoder is thinking about when he's thinking about the significance of Christ's life and what it means for Christians. You have the symbolism of all this political military force, and you have the contrasting picture of Jesus. And within this context, even Jesus' own disciples, after all these months, these years of being with Jesus, their first impulse is to respond violently to defend Jesus.
We kind of determined that a lot of his disciples were slow learners, man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is like, yeah, I mean, this is the night of betrayal, right? The final exam, and Peter's, although he means well, I guess, yeah, failing the test once again. Two more passages for us.
Can I make one comment about the last passage?
Sure, yeah.
As we're talking about a response to this display of power, we ought to consider the display of power itself. And your ... version.
Yeah.
So from 6 to 9, Jesus basically said, I've been out in the open and you didn't come to me with this, you know?
Yeah.
And so if you're in power, don't you have an obligation to kind of perform your duties in the light of day so that people can hold you accountable for it? And I'm not sure exactly what that says about the institution of war, but
Yeah,
it's disturbing, I think.
no, it's very good. It's very good, yeah. I had to restrain myself, as you'll see, and just like not giving you too much text, right? The cardinal rule of PowerPoint, just don't put a bunch of text, but
Yeah.
it's stuff like that, right? I mean, if we spent more time with these passages, read more of the verses, we get, I think, more of that great detail. So this one may be less familiar to us. So another passage from Matthew, and this is the healing of the centurion's servant. So when Jesus entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, appealing to him and saying, Lord, my servant is lying at home paralyzed in terrible distress. And Jesus said to him, I will come and cure him. The centurion answered, Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only speak the word and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man under authority and with soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes. And to my slave, do this, and the slave does it. When Jesus heard him, he was amazed and said to those who followed him, truly I tell you, no one in Israel have I found such faith. And Jesus said to the centurion, go, let it be done for you according to your faith. And the servant was healed in that hour. Why do you think people are thinking about the topic of war and how we as Christians should deal with it? Why would this passage, do you think, be of any interest and relevance? Or just, if you're not confident about your own answer, right? Just reading it now together. What are your thoughts and observations?
Well, the centurion's not part of Jesus's tribe, so to speak. He would have been considered an outsider, someone unclean, someone not of the faith. And yet he's making the request and Jesus is responding to the request.
And I also think that he was concerned for his slave, for his servant, someone that I would have thought that he may not be concerned about.
Other observations?
And Jesus never turned anybody away. He'd heal them. Whether they're lepers or whatever, he would, respond and try to help them.
it raises the question for me of, I mean, this is saying that Jesus has the power to do things without even being present for it. And so why does God not act in a situation where the Vandals have come in and raided a town in Germany?
Yeah. All good observations. I have just a few thoughts. First, a centurion in this context is, again, a representative of military power and an enemy, right? This is
Like
the-
Hamas now.
Well, yeah, we can get to that at another point, but before we jump to the present day, in this context, in the first century, with all these people, these Jews who are surrounded listening to Jesus teach, in this context walks a military official who's occupying their land, who's been sent there to, if necessary, use force to keep order. And then there are two amazing things about this passage, right? First, and even amazement in Jesus himself. In verse 10 there, he says, "Truly I tell you, in no one in Israel have I found such faith." So there's this shocking detail here, that Jesus is surrounded by his own people, using their own texts, reading their scriptures, teaching them. And of all the people who get it, understand the significance of his ministry and what it means, it's the centurion who has faith. The second thing I think worth noting is there are people who receive condemnation from Jesus for the way that they live, who receive vocal and harsh criticism, but for whatever reason, the centurion is not one of them. And I think everyone in Jesus' presence would have expected him to turn that centurion away, to refuse the request, because of who a centurion was in that context. And part of the challenge of the early Christians, the first couple of centuries, is can you be a Christian, a member of our community, and be a member of the Roman military? That was a really, really painful, difficult question for Christians in the early Christian church. And a passage like this suggests, right, and some would conclude that if you have someone in the Roman army who has decided to join the Christian church and the community, it is not necessary for them to leave the Roman army. That they could still be a good Christian and a centurion or a member of some military unit in Rome. So this last passage, we won't spend, in the interest of time, talking about it in great detail, but a very famous passage as well. This is from Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 13. And I'll just read it out loud here. So Paul, in writing to the Christians in Rome, says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Do you wish to have no fear of the authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive its approval. For it is God's agent for your good. But if you do what is wrong, you should be afraid, for the authority does not bear the sword of vain. It is the agent of God to execute wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be subject not only because of wrath, but also because of conscience. For the same reason, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are God's agents, busy with this very thing." So we looked at a passage from the Sermon on the Mount, challenging any Christian who would say, with integrity, right, with a good conscience, that I can endorse war and still follow the teachings of Jesus. This is the kind of passage we have in the New Testament. It presents a real challenge to those of us who are inclined to say that pacifism is the only legitimate Christian option, and that Christians can endorse war. So just another passage to wrestle with, right? And the point here is that looking in the New Testament on its own, not even taking into account the Old Testament, looking across the span of Christian history, from the earliest Christian communities through the Middle Ages up to the 20th century, there is no single voice on the issue of war in the Christian tradition. And so our challenge is to try to take all these different points of view, different voices, try to make sense of them in some way. Do we have a power cord by chance?
Okay.
For the laptop? So, the first of our theologians that we're going to look at today, discuss, is John Howard Yoder. Thank you very much. He was a Mennonite theologian who taught at a Mennonite seminary and then later finished his career at Notre Dame, teaching Christian ethics there and working at an Institute for Peace. He was actually a student of Karl Barth's as well, which is sort of interesting. And this is a great detail. So he did his PhD, or PhD under Karl Barth, and he was supposed to write about the history of the Mennonite Church and the Reformation in Switzerland. And when he came to deliver his dissertation, what he delivered to Karl Barth was an extended critique of Karl Barth's position on war, on the basis of Karl Barth's own theology. I would just say that I think there are different voices we could have used for the pacifist position. It is a tradition within the church in the very beginning. Yoder is, in many ways, I think, the most influential in recent history in the 20th century for this position. And maybe Anna would disagree, but in my experience, going through seminary, it's hard to overstate how influential, I think, in the last couple of decades, John Howard Yoder's thoughts on Christianity and war have been. There's like an entire generation of seminary students, young pastors, who have read John Howard Yoder and somebody deeply influenced by John Howard Yoder, Stanley Hauerwas, if you've ever heard of him, who taught at Duke Divinity School. And everybody just loves this stuff. So I was surrounded by kids in seminary who thought that John Howard Yoder's sort of point of view was really kind of the only viable Christian point of view. And so anybody who felt like war was just, could be justified on a Christian basis, had to kind of make the point, right? State the case, because it was so self-evident to my classmates that this was the correct point of view.
Just wanted to ask somebody about one of my favorite movies, Band of Brothers. Eisenhower's parents were Mennonites, but then the hero of that whole series, Dick Winters, was a very devout Mennonite. So how would the conversation go between them and Yoder?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. Well, like I said, across the Christian tradition, we have different voices. Even within the Mennonite tradition, there are different voices, right? And the part of the tradition that Yoder embraced was the one that was politically active, but also nonviolent. But even within the Mennonite tradition, right, there's that ambiguity. So a couple key points from Yoder's writings. And we'll focus here on one of his books, probably the most influential, popular, The Politics of Jesus. And I've got a visual aid here too, so. I will, on our next session, have like a list of recommended reading if you're interested. So more to come on that, but The Politics of Jesus, published in the 70s, very influential. And here are a couple of observations from Yoder. So first, writing in the 1970s, Yoder's first point is Christian ethics has lost sight of the New Testament and has somehow come to just ignore the life of Christ entirely. We're doing Christian ethics without actually reading our own text and thinking about Jesus in a serious way. If you actually read the New Testament, then what you notice is the second point here, God in Jesus brings a new kingdom to earth in the first century. A kingdom that is the task of the Christian church to continue and embody. And what are two key attributes or central practices of that new community or the new kingdom? Nonviolent resistance and what Yoder would call revolutionary subordination. We'll talk a little bit about this in a second. And a final point, and this will be important in comparing Yoder with Barth. In The Politics of Jesus, there's a really interesting discussion in Yoder about all those weird passages in the New Testament where we have people talking about the powers of the world, the angels, the forces, the stuff that we read over and we're like, okay, right. Maybe good for first century, but like none of us really think the angels, right, are like executing these kind of like cosmic battles right up in the heavens against the evil forces. But Yoder, to his credit, actually tries to read these and think seriously about what they mean for us as Christians today. And so he has an entire chapter where he talks about what could this possibly mean for us as Christians in the 20th century? Is there anything we can learn from this? And it's quite revealing what he says. So first, on actually reading the New Testament, Yoder in his context says, look, we've got a lot of Christian ethicists. He's thinking about the Niebuhr brothers, if you're familiar with them. Reinhold Niebuhr, Richard Niebuhr. Reinhold Niebuhr, incidentally, very influential on President Barack Obama, one of his favorite authors. Very public, prominent ethicists from the church who were also engaged in politics and had a lot of influence in that time. And Yoder accuses them basically of ignoring the gospel and ignoring the New Testament, and somehow justifying that the life of Jesus, the Jesus we encounter in the Gospels, is not applicable or relevant for Christian ethics today. Yoder thinks this is deeply mistaken, so he asks us to read the gospel narrative with the constantly pressing question, is there here a social ethic? Do we actually have an ethical moral program? And Yoder says that if you actually read the New Testament, read the Gospels, the ministry and the claims of Jesus are best understood as presenting to hearers and readers not the avoidance of political options, but one particular social, political, ethical option. And in reading the Gospels, this is a very interesting sort of take, I think. Yoder looks at a lot of current historical research and analysis of people studying the first century writings, the New Testament, thinking about what was actually the case in that historical context. And what Yoder says is if we take into account the insights from scholars, read the New Testament carefully. In Jesus's own context and in this time, there was all this momentum and push for a violent political counterreaction to the Roman Empire within the Jewish community. And what Yoder thinks is these passages about the temptation of Jesus, when he's out in the desert for 40 days, Satan says, you know, everybody can bow down and worship you if you will just do this. In the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus is pleading for this cup to be taken from me, the real temptation that Jesus faced was to use his community, use his power within, or influence within the community, and pursue a political, violent, military coup to reestablish within Israel at the time a sovereign Jewish state. And so, in the context of the Garden of Gethsemane and reading this passage, Yoder says the only imaginable real option in terms of historical seriousness, and the only one with even a slim basis in the text, is the hypothesis that Jesus was drawn at this very last moment of temptation to think once again of the messianic violence with which he had been tempted since the beginning. Now is finally the time for holy war. And once more, now clearly for the last time, the option of the crusade beckons. Once more, Jesus sees this option as a real temptation. And once more, he rejects it. But as we know, right in the Gospels, Jesus does not pursue a political coup. Jesus does not take up the temptation of using force, violent force against the Roman occupiers, and establishing himself as king of a new Jewish nation. But rather than reacting with violence, embodies the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount, turns the other cheek, doesn't respond with force, and it leads to his crucifixion. And Yoder says, if we read these passages and think about them, what we see is that Jesus was not just a moralist whose teachings had some political implications. He was not primarily a teacher of spirituality whose public ministry, unfortunately, was seen in a political light. He was not just a sacrificial lamb preparing for his immolation, or a God-man whose divine status calls us to disregard his humanity. Jesus was, in his divinely mandated prophethood, priesthood, and kingship, the bearer of a new possibility of human, social, and therefore political relationships. So Yoder says, if you want to actually know how to live as Christians, read the Gospels. It's really not that hard. There's all this noise. The Christian tradition has been deeply conflicted and compromised, going back to Constantine, the Roman emperor who endorsed Christianity as the official religion. But if we look at the Gospels in the early Christian church, it's clear. We've made it too complicated. There's an ethic of nonviolence, a social and political program for Christians to follow, and that's what Yoder wants us to see. Now, what about those powers? So in the chapter where Yoder talks about the discussion of powers and principalities and angels and demons, he makes these observations. Unfortunately, however, he says, we as humans have no access to the good creation of God. The creature and the world are fallen, and in this, the powers have their own share. And this is, I think, just really a remarkable passage. The powers, despite their fallenness, continue to exercise an ordering function. So he's thinking here about political states, global economy, just all the sort of societal forces and norms that shape us. These powers continue to exercise an ordering function, but even tyranny is still better than chaos, and we should be subject to it. It's interesting to me that Yoder's take on this is that the world is deeply fallen, society is held together, and humanity is sustained by these social political forces. But he says this is something like tyranny, keeping order, which is better than chaos, and just human society completely disintegrated.
It's interesting to me that he was born in 1928, so he was old enough to remember World War II, and yet he had that opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I think what's helpful here to keep in mind is this Mennonite tradition. So the Mennonites are a Protestant tradition who are always sort of on the fringes. They sometimes have favorable relationships with political authorities, sometimes they don't. But they are a community and a tradition that was never on the inside, never had political power, but sort of had to find ways to survive and persist, sometimes in the face of oppression and political opposition.
CJ, can I back up for the
Sure.
This first sentence. Unfortunately, however, we have no access to the good creation of God, creation of the world by Paul. So what's the interpretation of that?
So I reread that sentence. So a couple weeks ago, I cracked open this book again in preparation for this class, reread that sentence. In sort of disbelief that a theologian would say that, and reread it again. I think he means what he says, in the sense that the world is so marked by sin. Our social political institutions are so bent on oppressing people, abusing people, and using violent force, that it is not possible for us to kind of peer past those abuses, that sin, to find God's original design in human society and institutions. The darkness is just too thick.
So we just live with it because it's better than the chaos.
Right. I don't think you're the only one. It has that skepticism.
Well, and it's
Yeah.
interesting coming from someone with Mennonite, where they left the oppression of the absolute rulers of Europe to thrive in a country that was founded in a revolution against those absolute powers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll just say, in the interest of time, pick up the pace a little bit so we can get to Bart, and I think there we find a really interesting contrast. So Yoder just says that subordination to these powers is what makes us human. For if they did not exist, there would be no history, nor society, nor humanity, right? So this is how we maintain that order. If then God is going to save his creatures in their humanity, the powers cannot simply be destroyed or set aside or ignored. Their sovereignty must be broken, and this is what Jesus did. Concretely and historically, by living a genuinely free and human existence. His very obedience unto death is in itself not only a sign, but also the first fruits of an authentic restored humanity. So in other words, Jesus, through his life, and just to be clear, right? He's focused on the Gospels, the actual historical Jesus. But for Yoder, this is God incarnate. This is not like some human being with divine powers, right? This is God, God's self, in the person of Jesus, institutes a new way of living, a new human community. And it's interesting that Yoder thinks maybe our lives won't end in crucifixion. But if Christians are serious about this new community and embodying the values, the life of Christ, they will encounter opposition from those forces. You can't coexist peacefully. That's why nonviolent resistance is called for. And the revolutionary subordination here is that in submitting oneself to persecution, to violent opposition at the hands of political, economic forces, there's a transformative work that's done that opens up the possibility of living differently to others. They see there's a new way to live, there's a better way to live. But Christians can't be like Niebuhr and sort of friendly with the political establishment, get invited to Washington dinners, right, deliver lectures to senators and representatives, or established judges.
Can I ask a question? What did he mean by nonviolent resistance then?
I think what he means is, in Jesus's case, right, if we think about, so the option was there, his followers were presumably willing to defend him, use force, he renounced it, and he understood that in renouncing it, it was going to lead to his public execution. And I think Yoder's call is that Christians, despite the temptation to use force in certain instances, violence, whether it's on an individual level, but especially with respect to the state, military forces, Christians just have to renounce it, the use of violence in all forms. And he doesn't think the resistance part there, right? The nonviolent part's clear, but the resistant part is this is an alternative to what he says is insurrection on the one hand and quietism on the other. So I think you can think, right, in this context, the nonviolent marches and civil rights movement. That wasn't quietism. That was an embrace of nonviolence that was revolutionary. And it ultimately had political consequences. So he's looking for that sort of nonviolent sort of action that will actually, has something at stake and makes a point publicly.
Kind of like Gandhi, the way he, led that.
Right.
movement.
Right.
In about 8 minutes.
Okay. So we might have to pick up Karl Barth a little bit next week, which is fine. But I would just try to go through this as much as we can here. So Karl Barth, a Reformed theologian in Switzerland, overlaps a little bit with John Howard Yoder. So lived from 1886 to 1968. Again, deeply influential. I think along with somebody like Yoder, still is required reading for everyone in seminary. You have to come to terms with Barth one way or another. And again, deeply influential in what he said about the Christian faith. And he has this set of books called the Church Dogmatics, which if you've ever seen like on a bookshelf, it's like 13 books the size of this, and he wrote other stuff too. Tons of words. The type is like this big on some of the pages. There's like the big text, and then he has tiny text next to it that adds like additional commentary. But in one of his volumes in the Church Dogmatics, where he's talking about the doctrine of creation and what Christians think about creation, he has a discussion of war, and it's in the context of the protection of life. Life is a gift from God, and in this context, he says, how should Christians think about war? And come to terms with the commandment that thou shalt not kill, is how he translates it. So his observations: human life belongs to the God, the Creator. And with respect for human life comes its protection. Bart thinks that war is what he calls a nevertheless. It's a capitalized term in this whole section. And he thinks that despite the commandment to honor, protect, preserve life, there are certain social, ethical, moral situations in which it seems on the face of it like we're violating that commandment. That's a nevertheless. He thinks about euthanasia, abortion, capital punishment, and the final discussion is on war. He thinks that war can be embraced, or maybe not embraced, right, but justified from a Christian point of view as a protection of life. And this is where it gets really heady. But another important point that Bart makes is that in thinking about creation as Christians, we can't just think about sort of the natural order, the way things are in the world. We have to situate the world, its creation, in the context of Jesus Christ. And what Bart says is God's decision in the person of Jesus Christ, and the second person of the Trinity, to create the world and have fellowship with the world, despite knowing that humanity will reject God and resist. So our understanding of who Christ is and the significance of God's grace in Christ should inform our understanding of creation. So first, just this basic premise that life belongs to the Creator God. Bart says human life, one's own and that of others, belongs to God. Therefore, respect is due to it. And with respect, protection against each and every callous negation and destruction. Interestingly, Bart says, right, that life itself is not the highest good. It's not an absolute good. Only God is an absolute good. So the protection of life is not unlimited and it's not absolute. But, he says, with this self-evident modification, it is commanded absolutely. And what Bart will do sometimes is like try to hold two thoughts in tension, right? In a way, it's a very European thing to do. I'm not sure that we as Americans kind of have that intellectual sensibility, but. Then Bart says if there can be any question of a just war, and indeed, it can only be with the same, and indeed with even stricter reserve and caution than have been found to be necessary in relation to such things as suicide, abortion, capital punishment. All affirmative answers to this question are wrong from the very outset, and it constitute a flat betrayal of the gospel if they ignore the whole risk and venture of this nevertheless. So Bart's point here is, even if we as Christians embrace the possibility of a just war, and think that in certain instances, the protection of life requires engaging in war, the only way we as Christians can do that with integrity is to recognize the serious gamble venture that is, right? Given the awful, awful nature of the war, the commandment to not kill or murder. There's a lot in Bart's mind to say in favor of pacifism, and Christians who are serious about thinking about just war need to recognize the power of pacifism. And to say that nevertheless, in certain circumstances, it's justified. Just one final observation, then we'll wrap up, and we can pick up Bart in 2 weeks. So when is war justified, potentially? So it's when a nation, a people's state are thrown into a wholly abnormal situation of emergency where their very existence as a common community is threatened. So Barth says the conduct of one state or nation can throw another into the wholly abnormal situation of emergency, in which not merely its greater or lesser prosperity, but its very existence and autonomy are menaced and attacked. Nothing less than this final question must be at issue if a war is to be just and necessary. And why would that be the case? The obvious answer, says Barth, is that there may well be bound up with the independent life of a nation responsibility for the whole physical, intellectual, and spiritual life of the people comprising it, and therefore their relationship with God. Contrast this with what Yoder said about no access to God's good creation. Barth says that in some instances it's necessary for countries, states, acting in defense of themselves or even on behalf of and in defense of other states to resort to war to protect life. And why is that? Because Barth thinks creation is good. We know that from the life of Christ. And it's possible that in the life of a nation and a country, the conditions are provided where people can enjoy a religious life and relationship with God. An important contrast, right, with Yoder and his thinking about the country. And I will just say, sorry, there's a great aside. Barth never talks in the first person, really, in his church dogmatics. But after this passage and small text, he says, and let it be known that if anybody challenged the territorial integrity or political unity of the Swiss Confederation, I would stand up and defend it. So some concluding thoughts. So I think when thinking about war in the Christian tradition, we have competing ambiguous sources, but the important thing to note, right, is these are mutually exclusive voices. There's no way to sort of take both sides here. We have a tradition that recognizes the power of pacifism and nonviolence in the life of Christ, and another tradition that says there's something deeply paradoxical, but also necessary in certain circumstances, and taking up arms, conducting war to protect life. And the only other point I'll say is our theology matters. So I brought in the stuff about the powers, about the goodness of creation, because we as Christians can't just sort of like pull moral lessons directly from the New Testament or the Old Testament, right? We have to think about it kind of holistically. Who do we think Jesus is? What's the significance of creation? What's the significance of the church? And those thoughts will inform how we think about war. Thanks for going over a little bit. We will pick this up in 2 weeks. And thanks for your time.